So Jodie, you saw my movie yesterday. What'd you think?
I thought it
How'd it
was
go?
great, Blake. I really enjoyed seeing your film. Really happy to get to have this opportunity to have our own Q&A here, because I was jealous of the film festival organizers getting to ask you all the questions yesterday. So
But you had your own Q&A today for your movie Wasteland #1, Ardent, Verdant.
I know it was equally awkward. So we can be filmmaker to filmmaker, talking about it. So one of the things that really struck me about Prototype was the various uses of historical applications of 3D imagery. There are some sort of stereoscope images. There are some maybe training field guide-ish images that you mentioned.
You mean the eye test?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also, a lot of the time we're seeing these images playing out on monitors. So there's this idea of technology mediating the image. Can you speak a little more about that? I know that you're really interested in the historical development of 3D. How did you start to collect these images and work to build this film?
Well, I was making the movie over a period of about 2 years, but it was only actually about 4 or 5 months before the whole movie was completed that certain elements like the stereographs from 1900 sort of arrived for me. Like I became aware of them, or I found them just by looking through Google image searches, and which brought me to the Library of Congress archive that they have online, where they had about roughly 36 shots from the aftermath of the Galveston hurricane. And so, it was actually only around the same time that the conceit of watching a lot of the movie as being re-photographed off of those monitors came. So that was another thing that completely reshaped the direction of the movie and the overall tone and aesthetic of the movie. And but yeah, I mean, because the movie was naturally set around the time that cinema was kind of coming into being in the form that we know it to be. It was because I was looking at this Galveston hurricane that happened in 1900. It was an intrinsic part of thinking through the material of the movie, and thinking about like technological development and just the way that certain technologies are tied to historical time periods and become part of the character of that time period. Because actually everything about 1900 as it appears in the movie is in some ways completely arbitrary. Like the arrival of cinema and developing from photography and from stereophotography, the development of the auto industry, like all of these happen at that moment because of just certain processes and a certain temporality of the way things were progressing. But like the one kind of fact of the movie that really is outside of human intervention is the presence of that storm, and like the arrival of that storm on that specific day in that specific part of the world. Now that's not so much the case, just because storms seem to be more of a human cause. There's a lot more causality in terms of like things that are happening in the world, temperament, like in terms of climate, and so it's interesting also to think about that in terms of the comparison of the two. But yeah, it was just a natural thing about integrating technology in that way. But yeah, I was actually thinking about it while watching your movie today, just because you have a very prominent technological component in Wasteland #1, where you're looking at the circuit boards of the computer as juxtaposed with the images of the flowers that you have, which the only other film that I could say feels similar in that sense is the Blanket Statement, All or Nothing. I don't remember if it was Blanket Statement #1 or #2, but that's another film that feels kind of algorithmic in a way, and kind of using handmade processes in order to mimic like computational or algorithmic ideas. And so I'm curious about your own take on technology, especially as someone who largely works in a very analogical format of 60 millimeter as opposed to video.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think that my film today especially plays on some sort of relationship with the three-dimensional, because there is this collision between the flat and the rippled in some ways, because it's an alternation of photographs and circuit boards that have very tiny bumps and strings hanging out of them. And I would probably guess that you're speaking about blanket statement number 2, because the idea of the thread, I think, or the fuzz or the pilling of fabric does appear to sort of stick out. I think that I'm really interested in texture and how it can appear to sort of come out of the screen in a lot of ways. And of course, when I started making films, I would work in cameraless filmmaking by sticking things onto the film strip that were actually real 3D. And when you made a print, it was a completely different experience, because the plastic was stuck onto the film going through the projector, and you could really see shadow and things. And then when it was rephotographed, of course, it would go away. But yeah, I think that you're zoning into one of the thematic concerns of my film that I showed today, Wasteland number 1, which is sort of what we discussed in the Q&A, that I'm fascinated at the measures humans will take to create systems upon systems upon systems to recreate reality. I am fascinated with the construction of perspective as a drawing unit, how it functions with painting and methods of using materials to execute the same properties of light. And of course, this all comes into question with the birth of photography, and everyone's sort of, and basically I just see the humans as constantly recreating system after system after system of a new way to represent reality, which still yet does not. I mean, even those are they called stereoscopes? The early images in your films from stereoscopes?
Stereographs. Or stereo cards even. Or stereo views.
Stereo views.
Yeah.
Some of those I thought were some of the most advanced 3D images I've ever seen, but they're still obviously working within a two-dimensional plane, which is that's almost like they're cutouts to me in a way. Like this is up here, but it appears flat, and here's, like, we're in the theater and we have the different waves going on, and we're all going like this to make the illusion of waves and stage design.
Yeah.
There's still this sense of the handmade that comes through, which is something, of course, I could really appreciate, because I try not to buy into planned obsolescence and constantly refining technologies, especially with ones that obviously work, such as 16 millimeter photography. So that was something that was so pleasurable about watching your film, was that it didn't really take a position on some of these things so much as allow the viewer to make their own assumptions. But just to clarify, were you working on the film as a collection of images that weren't associated with Galveston until the last 4 months of the process?
No, it was always a part of the idea. It was at some point it was going to be a movie that was thinking that was kind of operating under the conceit that that digital 3D photography, moving image photography, existed at the birth of cinema in 1900, and so it was going to be a found footage film of, like, as though someone had, like, they unearthed an old camera and they found it, and this was, like, the prototype was going to be the image reel of whatever was loaded in that camera, or like a stash of cameras was found, and this was like a montage of moments from that. And so it was always a bit hazy of, like, what shape the movie would take. But once I started thinking about not so much the image capture devices, but the image exhibition devices, and creating a kind of alternate imagined media device that would be displaying those types of images, that's kind of what became the dominant feature of the movie, and having that that object, that televisual object that I made with the Philco TVs.
And do you find that most of the questions or critical reception about your film centers around the film itself or the technology in which you've chosen to apply? Because I felt like the fact that your movie was in 3D was actually secondary to what the movie was. There's so many great editing tricks going on. There's this soundtrack that's sort of lulling everything together. So how do you take?
It's a thing with a lot of newer or unorthodox formats, I find. Just like the idea that when you go see a movie at the multiplex, like a 2D movie that's in color, you don't really go into the movie expecting it to like justify itself as a colored movie, or be like, why'd you make this in color as opposed to black and white? But somehow with 3D, I mean, that was probably greeted with color, like Technicolor in the 30s and 40s. Like, did you really have to go the extra mile and make this in color? But once it becomes standardized, that kind of falls away. But because 3D has never become standardized, to make a 3D movie is to somehow make a movie that needs to justify its 3D-ness or be about its 3D-ness in some way. And so I think that is a lot of what a lot of people respond to. That's kind of the dominant element that is there. But at the same time, I tend to talk about the movie more as a kind of stream of thought and as an organization of a certain state of mind. And so for me, that's the primary experience of the movie, and it's just kind of the spatiality of the 3D-ness of the movie is kind of complicating how that's being presented to you, but it's not necessarily like present in order for you to contemplate that specifically. But in the same way that I don't think that you necessarily make 16mm films in a way that is beckoning to the viewer to like consider its 16mm-ness. I mean, that's one of the things that, I mean, you were mentioning earlier, like with perspective, but one of the things that I like about some of your films, including the one today, that has somehow a bit of motion with what's happening off camera, in addition to what's happening on camera. Because when you film, you have certain films that are just filmed fabrics, and you just get the sense that the filmed cloths or materials feel as though they're pressed flat against the screen. But you kind of have a push-pull with that in a movie like Wasteland #1, because with the circuit board, you kind of get a movement of the light source so that the shadow shifts a bit, and it kind of activates and pushes away the filmed object, and it no longer, it moves back and forth from feeling like it's pressed against the screen or feeling like it's actually going into the screen space. And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe your interest overall with flatness and the flattening of things, and kind of disrupting that in certain moments with gestures like the movement of light sources.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think for the most part, my interest in flatness centers around an inability to visually understand many aspects of perspective.
Right.
And of course, working on a down-shooting tabletop camera, where often you are laying your drawings or your collages or your fabrics flat. So it's something I've really struggled with, is trying to sort of go in there and get it to come out. Mm-hmm. And that's why, disrupting the light sources, playing around with the angles, or moving light in time over things that might be, there's quite a few works now that incorporate reflective materials to experiment with how light is bouncing off in different ways. Mm-hmm. That's something that's becoming more of an impulse. I think that a lot of the times I go to film festivals and I feel jealousy of those going out in the world, and having like shadows and light sources and moving trees, because it's just something that is so often not a part of my practice. Mm-hmm. And I think you could go either way on that argument. A lot of animation industry films, again, go deep into this notion of humans constructing systems to create reality, to create their own realities. Of course, Walt Disney manipulated the animation camera to create the multiplane camera so that you could zoom through different spaces, and really, again, try to build out all elements of a spatial diegesis.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's almost like, why not emphasize the flatness if you can? Because one of the most exciting things for me about animation is that you have the potential to create something that does not exist. Something that's virtually impossible in real life, which, is this flat world.
Mm-hmm.
Unless, of course, we consider the mechanism of cinema or the mechanism of television, as a source for consumption. Because that was, again, with the monitors in your film,
Mm-hmm.
something that really disrupted the notion of the 3D and at times, because
Mm-hmm.
we're, dealing with this flat mechanism. And again, this sense of technological mediation. Which brings up another question I had for you. I don't necessarily think that the nature technology thing is really just rampant in my film. I saw a lot of it going on in your film. And there's a few questions that I have about that. I think one of them has to do with your understanding of the relationship between abstraction and different functions of nature. Because, of course, there are moments that in your film that sort of echoed some of the more particle-based abstract animators of our time. Like, I thought about Mikino Takashi a few times.
Okay.
While watching the ocean scene. I got the sense that, I don't know, maybe you were making, I don't think you're necessarily trying to state anything, but you're sort of playing about with these ideas of nature affecting us and us affecting nature
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, because there are a lot of natural images and then, of course, constructed images. So how did you think to play those images against each other?
I don't know if I did it like as you're saying. I don't know if there was any conscious decision that was being made at any point with regards to that. But just because perhaps it's the type of image that I'm drawn to, just because a lot of the images that I filmed were just things that happened to catch my eye when I was going through whatever place I happened to be in at any given moment, and just filming what seemed right to me. And so I guess there might be a natural appeal that I have to filming certain natural settings, but I mean, there are a number of things in the movie that are presented to you at a certain point that is relatively unmediated and within the context of the movie, and then they will reappear later on with another layer of mediation added to them. So you'll see like the flowers, or you'll see the curling ocean waves as they are, you could say, and then you would see them later on in the movie again on a television monitor or in the deep abstract section when the waves finally reemerge through this process of passing through however many layers of light and muck or whatever it's passing through, and you arrive there at the beginning again. But yeah, I don't know if I have any like coherent or well thought out feelings about nature and technology. I just kind of let those things happen. Just letting them.
Do you see 3D as a way to enhance reality or to disrupt reality? Or neither of those ways?
I don't know if I really think too much about reality itself as a thing. Like, I'm more interested in certain sensations that come out of looking at a three-dimensional image, like the sensation of having something come out at you or appear as though it's coming out of the screen and entering into your auditorium space, which is intended in some way, or at least it's implicitly a safe space where no matter what peril or danger is happening on screen, you're there, just with other fine people who want to watch a movie for a couple of hours. But that's one of the things with 3D is that it's part of the appeal of the spectacle, or at least Hollywood seems to think so, of having objects come out of the screen at you and have this moment of startle that you get. And so I don't really have any such things, like kind of boo moments in my movies, but you still, I think, feel something that is a disruption of your safe space when you watch any three-dimensional imagery, especially in a moving three-dimensional image in a cinema, that I think triggers certain basic instincts that you might have of trying to protect yourself, or feel like if there is an incoming threat, that you kind of go into a certain instinctive protective mode for a brief moment until you cognitively process what's happening and get back into this moment of, okay, no, this is an illusion. It's not actually happening. It's a spectacle. It's a simulation of reality, and so it's something that's there but also not there. And so I'm interested in that kind of, I guess, liminal space of having your body reacting to something in a way that's natural to how your body functions, but also having your cognitive awareness of what technology is capable of and what it's not capable of, and letting that kind of mediate that experience, which I think is the main appeal for 3D for me, which I guess does tap into questions about reality and the lack thereof. But yeah, it's funny. I mean, also when I think about space, it's always a question of kind of, in terms of it being an aesthetic experience in artwork in general. It's always more of a feeling of unrest that I have, and I was thinking about this when looking at your film, and you mentioned this in the Q&A also, that when you're looking at the film, it is always this kind of horizontal, front-facing gaze at the screen as a space that's in front of you, but then at the same time you know, or at least I know, because I have a sense of how you made it, that the actual gaze of the image is a downward gaze, or as you imply, it is a downward gaze in the case of the images of the flowers, but at the same time you see the sky, which implies an upward gaze. And I think one of my main interests in making more spatially aware movies was probably having to do with my fear of heights and my fear of flying, and just this feeling of looking down or being too high up, and so looking up at the same time. And so I get this kind of similar bit of unrest in looking at a movie like yours, where I'm looking at something that is presented to me as though it's right in front of me, but I know, or at least I have the sensation of feeling that I'm actually looking downward or I'm looking upward. So I'm curious if you have feelings about this kind of direction of the gaze in your movie, and how that's played out with the exhibition practice of cinema as always being forward facing, as opposed to something that you might project on the ceiling or on the floor and look at it that way, in a way that's oriented to how it was actually photographed.
Sure. I mean, I think particularly in my film today, we have this sort of trifecta of colliding vantage points, whether it's we think we're looking down, or we think we're looking up, or we think we're looking straight ahead. But I don't really wish to experiment with the notions of expanded cinema, or projecting on the ceiling, or this, that, and the other. It's actually really like the idea that the cinema is just right here in front of me, because I actually think it's really historically important that it sort of echoes the space of a proscenium theater, which in turn echoes the space of church, as we also discussed earlier. I have no religion, but I just like the idea of everybody coming together and experiencing something that is potentially spiritually charged in some way.
Like devotional in some sense, even?
Perhaps, yeah, to each one's own. And something that was striking to me about what I was just asking you about the social reality, are we interrupting reality? Maybe let's just throw out the word reality and come back to the word diegesis for this space, because I've never been interested in creating that space at all, or maybe in some of my new works, but to me it's always like, how can I disorient my viewer and slap them around as much as possible and take them on a wild journey? Because, of course, I think that there's a temporal diegesis for animation, which would be that of sequence. You know, like one coming after the other. This is the truth of motion. And to me, it's much more interesting to sort of go back and forth between different truths of motion to create even the illusion of arrest. Like sometimes I don't even think that my films are actually moving, and you need to really get into the right groove. You need to have your flicker refresh rate sort of in tune with that of the projector's strobe,
right.
To really get into it. So yeah, I think again with this interest of creating things that are impossible or things that could only be imagined, trying to think of ways to break up the continuity of both space and time have become increasingly important to my work.
Yeah, you were mentioning earlier, like thinking about animation, and it's like etymologically, like referring to like the practice of bringing life to something, which obviously goes back to like almost like spirit photography, like the sense of like seeing into some beyond or into some underworld, or seeing presences that are actually here in reality but only visible via the technology. And so you do get this sense with like the stroboscopic quality of your films of seeing it's not quite superimposition, but it almost approximates superimposition, where you're seeing something that is never actually physically in front of you, but like with persistence of vision, it's something that seems to be combining in order to create something new. And I guess that's goes back, just as you were saying, like to what cinema is. It's like creating something out of something that's not actually there, like showing motion when it's just stillness. But yeah.
Absolutely, and this is something I've been thinking about all week, actually, and talking with a few people about all week. Thinking about the notion of photographing someone and stealing their soul, or even that of live action photography being passive or being consuming something from the subject, whereas I always like to think of animation as an active or a productive way of producing an image. Like it has more to do with production than it does with consumption, because there's something new that's moving and it does have a new life, as opposed to the life that's sucked out of the image at hand, if that makes sense. If you go outside and animate something in real space, you're sort of zapping the tree of its charge and then recharging.
Is that productive for the audience as well, do you think? Or is it?
No idea. It's going to be different all over the place. But that's one thing that's always been very interesting to me about animation, because to me, that very truth of it being arguably being a productive as opposed to a consuming entity, it really allows the method of working, in my mind, to sidestep a lot of the questions around authorship, a lot of the questions that plagued photography at its origin, because it's really not as simple as just taking pictures or letting the camera roll. In many ways, like 3D images. So, I'm always tripping over this question, like, is cinema a type of animation, or is animation a type of cinema? Is cinema a type of animation, or is anima, you know what I'm saying? And I do think cinema is a type of animation.
But is animation a type of cinema?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
But, where, as far as the origins lie, I feel like the real potential was lost when we decided more to care more about live action than we did about animation, actually. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So, but enough about animation. Let's go back to Prototype and think about the life that you brought into. Can I ask you a question? Was I seeing mirrors in your film, or were those actually the monitors? Because I read this whole other self-reflexive element into this, where you see the blue sky.
In the monitors?
Yes, mirrors in the monitors.
But are you asking if any of the monitors themselves are mirrors?
No.
Okay, good.
I thought that there was sort of an image of a rear view mirror. And then when you mentioned the car, I thought that I was looking out the car. Well, I wanted to talk a little more, because we were talking yesterday in the Q&A about the horses and the birth of the auto industry. It's parallel to the time of the birth of the cinema industry. But something else that, is happening at the same time historically is the birth of the leisure travel industry, which is sort of why I was thinking about this agency on part of the consumer to be able to drive themselves around, or to be able to take trips, or to be able to not move physically at all and go to the movies and have the movie take for you. And so in many ways, I saw your film as something of a travelogue. Have you gotten that before in your Q&As?
Yeah.
What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it I think it's, as you're saying, it's like kind of true to the birth of the medium, just because like cinema did begin like in spaces like the Nickelodeon space, where it's mostly for like a proletariat class who couldn't necessarily afford to travel and see the world, couldn't afford to get on an airplane, couldn't afford to take the trains and go see everything, and so those things were brought to them, and they were able to pay a nickel and see these places that they couldn't afford to go to, and so it helped that I was traveling a lot at this time making the movie, but then it does become this way of glimpsing a kind of everywhere. It's kind of an everywhere movie. Like I don't literally go everywhere, but there are several notable places I don't go in the movie, but it's there's that sense of the focus being a bit atomized. Like it's looking, the gaze is scattered into many different places, so that it's not just focused on a single place or single type of place. It's this kind of omniscient way of taking in experience.
Yeah, and as you're talking about the cinema being a way to allow folks to travel other places without physically doing so or spending the money, I'm immediately reminded of cinema's initial potential as a teaching tool. And one of the things that really struck me about your movie was, again, you're speaking about this omniscient energy. I did get this sense of a universal language that you were working out in some ways, because of course you avoid text for the most part, and we're not really relying on narration in any way to take us, almost sort of like pre or post lingual in some ways. So could you talk a little bit about working with sound in relation to some of these images? Because where we're moving so much, the soundtrack does not, in some ways, almost lulls it all together. Almost as if it's like a big wash, or the seabed where all the images sit within. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, the sound, as I mentioned in no, I didn't mention that yesterday.
Well, they all blend in together.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned something yesterday as tying the whole room together, like the rug that ties the room together.
Yes.
Like the sound in a way ties the room together with in this movie, and the sound evolves over the course of itself, but it's not really in any way progressing. It's just kind of the sound kind of eats itself, you could almost say, and it just becomes either everywhere or it's disappearing down some hole that we are not going into. And so yeah, the sound is usually for me, I edit to a kind of basic ambient soundtrack of some kind in order to edit to some sort of rhythm of some kind, and react to the natural beats or rhythms of whatever is occurring in a track of a train moving, or of windshield wipers of a car beating back and forth, or in this case the clanging of an industrial warehouse factory. And so it's just kind of a beat to move to, even if it's not a regular beat or in any way like rhythmic. It's still something that I can collaborate with in some intuitive way. Yeah, I was actually surprised to find that Wasteland #1 doesn't have a soundtrack, because my memory of it was having a soundtrack, but I don't know what that soundtrack would have been. But you go back and forth, it seems, between having a soundtrack, and so I'm curious how you think of sound similarly, and what dictates whether or not your film will have a soundtrack or when it won't.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. some of my films are silent. A lot of them have quite complicated soundtracks. Some of them simple soundtracks. Wasteland is one of my shorter material studies, quite a few of which are either silent or dealing with sound on a completely indexical level. So for example, you mentioned one of the blanket statement films. The sound for each of those films actually comes from the image that's on the film, bleeding into the Super 16mm optical track of the film strip. So what you're hearing is actually what you're seeing going through the photoreceptor of the optical sound bulb. In other cases, of course, like my fake 3D movie, Let Your Light Shine, those were also made with images, all of those sounds.
Images that are occurring on screen, or did you?
Not images that are recorded on screen. It's actually based off of some of the ornament sound experiments that Oscar Fischinger made with John Cage, where they were looking at different borders and ornamental images, and then they would see how they sounded through the photoreceptor on 35mm. It was actually an exercise that I believe really sort of changed the route of contemporary music or experimental sound, given how huge Cage went on to be. He wrote this acrostic for Fischinger that's like, Oscar is like, when you showed me that sounds could be images, you set me on fire, and I ran into the water, but I was still on fire. Something like that. Really sweet. But yeah, essentially with optical sound and the history of graphic sound, you basically just need to take the frequency of any pitch that you would like to make and divide it by 24, and that's how many lines you need per frame to be able to make that sound. So Let Your Light Shine sound was sort of a gentle step into learning some of that knowledge and, making sounds out of scrapbooking scissors and pinking shears and things like that, and working with polyrhythms in a way that did relate to the animation rhythmically, but not necessarily indexically, whereas, they were drawing, so we were always seeing what we were hearing. So I think that it's important to consider what the role of sound is going to be in each new project, and I think some things are so overpowering visually they don't necessarily need sound, or they're going to sound would ground them in a strange way. I think sound is really powerful in a way to sort of spatially or emotionally color what you're doing. So just be very careful considering.
Speaking of carefulness, I was just curious, would you, you're often thought of as like a fun, kind of bubbly personality who makes films that are in some sense in line with that characterization, and I'm curious if you would think of yourself as someone who's trying to present an experience of happiness or joy or empathy in your work, or if that's somehow outside of how you think of your own practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing all the time about my bubbly personality, my bubbly films, and I think that's a really bogus reading of me and my films. I'm fun. I'm also a college professor that's been doing it for over a decade and a serious filmmaker. I think the main problems with my films and in regards to that interpretation is that of the tension between pleasure and rigor. And I'm working in the medium of animation, which is essentially a medium that's stigmatized to be children's entertainment. I'm a lot of the time working with craft-based materials to try and point out the silly distinctions of material or cultural value, in methods of making artwork. And it's almost like I have a double negative there going on. Like, this is a fun way of making films, and I'm going to use a fun material, and everything is really fun. And it's a challenge to turn the saccharine anxious. And I think a lot of the times what people don't think about is like, oh, your films are so colorful and bright. And I'm like, yeah, but the most colorful dyes are the most toxic dyes. You know what I'm saying? So I think that the films are deceptive in a certain way, which I think, you know, speaks to them as huge failures a lot of the time. And, you know, you always, but then again, you never want to throw things down your viewer's throat. Or, you know, so I like to think that my films are learning instead of teaching a lot of the time. But because they do sort of lack this position, and they refuse to take, my films refuse to take themselves seriously, I think, even though they're about serious subjects. And that's probably because I'm fairly critical, you know. I'm both within the avant-garde film world and critical of it. I'm both a consumer of these objects and critical of the systemic issues that support the infrastructure of making them. So, you know, I think that's a quite frustrating position to take for most people. They're just like, well, what side are you on? I'm just sort of, I don't know how you could go one way or the other at this point, you know, which is why I'm so interested, I think, in collisions of vantage points at this point, because I think that's where we've worked ourselves into as a society, you know, where we're super critical of things that we also depend on, you know. So that said, do you think that we should go get a latte in a paper cup?
Sure.